Next, we come to news of a restructuring plan in one of the country's most prized national institutions. It's right there in the name, the National Trust. It's a mainstay of the heritage community in this country, and it is also a darling of the middle classes, dare I say, as well, which is an issue that I've picked up on previously, but we'll come back to that probably in a moment or two. According to the Art newspaper on the 21st of August, this restructuring plan is one of the most damaging assaults on art historical expertise ever seen in the United Kingdom. And of course, they're picking up on the art historical because of the Art newspaper angle, but actually this touches on specialists in historical focus in particular, but also actually archaeological focus as well in the institution. And it all comes down to a restructuring. Seemingly, the excuse is post COVID-19. We hinted at this in an earlier segment this month, but possibly plans which have been floating around in someone's desk drawer for a while now to fundamentally change the focus of the National Trust away from a sort of a stewardship body and towards something a little bit more light touch when it comes to the relationship between membership, visiting the site, and the role that these individual sites are playing in looking after, in particular, artifacts and art in their care. Um, where do we begin with this one? Because actually, there are various different angles. We're going to include, for my sins, a link to the Daily Mail, the Daily Heil, um, with the headline, "Is the National Trust turning into a national joke?" Guy Adams investigates. If the advert will just get out of my way for a second, investigates how it's sacking art experts, dumbing down stately homes, and is obsessed with PC issues. So they've managed to attach this restructuring to a recent attempt within the National Trust to reassess many of their properties' connections to the slave trade. Um, what's the point of entry for this particular story?
Right. The point of entry for this particular story is a story that broke originally, I think, in the Times,
Mm.
where an internal paper that had been presented to the senior management of the trust, but not to the board of trustees.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not yet policy.
No.
Was leaked. Now, whenever you see a leak, you always ask who benefits.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And
Que
given
bono.
the
Que bono.
cui bono, indeed, and I think it's probably relatively safe to assume that whoever leaked this wanted to provoke exactly the kind of debate that we've just been describing that we're now having.
Yeah.
Because the reception has been almost uniformly hostile.
Yes.
The main paper that's being quoted is something written by Tony Berry, who is the Trust's, the job title is Visitor Experience Director.
Mm-hmm.
And basically it was a paper that was called Towards a 10-Year Vision for Places and Experiences.
Mm-hmm.
And it says things like mansions from evolution to revolution. Quote, our reliance on outdoors for growth has left us with a mansion offer that is still, despite cosmetic improvements, fundamentally unchanged since the 1980s, serving a loyal but by 2030 dwindling audience and enabled by loyal but dwindling volunteer base. The changes we'll need in our built places are revolutionary, not evolutionary. And then it argues we need to be much clearer about the places we can begin changing our approach to collections to display moving objects or taking them off display when needed to make spaces more flexible and accessible. And that phrase, flexible and accessible, really caught people's attention, because the implication is that they're trying to make National Trust buildings, and obviously it's most famous for holding many of Britain's stately homes in trust, making them more attractive and available for things like commercial hires, weddings, corporate events, that kind of thing, rather than being museums where you walk from room to room, where a volunteer's in each room, making sure you don't step over the rope.
Yeah.
Now, what went with this is a restructuring of staffing, which is being explained by the needs of COVID, the need of the trust to respond to COVID, and in particular to respond to the suggestion that it has lost just this year something like £200 million of income from footfall and memberships. One of the suggestions is, for example, that people who are worried about their jobs and about their money, their bank accounts, are cancelling luxuries like membership of organisations like the National Trust. Now, the shock at seeing that, so the combination of, oh my God, they're going to turn all the houses into theme parks, coupled with the suggestion that a lot of very experienced qualified staff could lose their jobs, was compounded by, I think, what most people would say was a fairly tin-eared response in the media by the Trust's Director General, Hilary McGrady, who did an interview on Newsnight and basically saying, look, it's a leak paper, it's not yet policy, but it's what we're going to have to do anyway. Basically,
which then brings into question whether or not the leak was sanctioned, as it were. In terms of flying the idea before actually having to discuss it.
Precisely. We can play that game. What is at stake is really the trust's in-house expertise. To give you an example, there's a very good analysis by the and the article you quoted originally from the art newspaper is actually by Dr. Ben Grosvenor, the art historian, who's writing particularly from an art historian's point of view about the loss of, for example, painting curators with expertise in paintings, particular expertise in paintings. There is a very good analysis in the Burlington magazine, which we'll post the link to below the line, where it argues, it says, and I'm quoting from the article, on the face of it, the level of redundancies is not unreasonable given the financial predicament faced by the trust in common with all cultural organisations. And we alluded to that earlier. COVID isn't over yet. Footfall can't return to what it was. There is a lot of financial pressure on individuals. Organisations are going to have to respond to this in some form or another. The trust has furloughed its staff, but the furlough scheme, as we referred, is winding up. Although a few minutes ago in Prime Minister's questions, although the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, said that he referred to people languishing on furlough and wanting to get people back to work. There is a growing sense in Parliament, it's being reported by political journalists, that a lot of MPs are uncomfortable with the furlough coming to an end and are pushing for support to particular sectors, of which the cultural sector could well be one. Certainly, and also the Labour Party, the main opposition party, also supports that, as does the Scottish Nationalists and others. So, watch this space on that one.
But in that sense, the notion of people languishing, or early on, I think we heard a couple of months ago this phrase, people becoming addicted to furlough as well, is a bizarre one, given that an awful lot of people who have been furloughed actually have been wanting to get back to work, or for example, in other cases, people haven't been furloughed, but they have been working from home. So there's a whole spectrum of different realities there. I think a blunt characterization isn't helpful, is it really?
No.
But it does nonetheless play into this ability to use it as an opportunity to restructure your organisation, I think.
Now, but one thing people have picked up, and again the Burlington magazine article picks up, is that the most recent restructure of the National Trust's professional staff was only in 2016, only 4 years ago. But they're saying that COVID is a game changer, that they have to lose something like it's about 13% of their staff altogether, which is actually 1,200 people, more or less, give or take. And those job losses are all out to consultation at the moment as part of a formal process. and there's another thing to factor in here, but a lot of critics of the trust have said, well, look, you look at the trust's accounts and there's 1.34 billion in reserves.
Yes.
Why can't you use that to subsidise this rough patch? To which the trust responds, well, actually, a lot of those reserves are actually restricted. So, for example, it's a legacy from somebody who said, I'll give you, £10,000 to invest in perpetuity so long as it's spent on National Trust gardens.
I see. Yeah, yeah.
Um,
Well, the
you
thing
know,
is, so I used to work for the National Trust. Back in
mm,
2010, I was working covering someone's maternity. It was a maternity leave position.
mm,
But it was an interesting and informative um, several months that I spent there, because at the time they were structuring something in the run up. In 2010 they were it was sort of post 2008 financial crash, and there was an analysis of their finances going on with a view to moving towards 2020.
yeah,
Little did they know what was coming. That they called
yeah,
the 2020 vision. If you see what they did there,
mm,
ha ha ha. Um,
yeah,
and ironically, they spent an awful lot of money on this 2020 vision, on the consultation surrounding it. And
mm,
one of the things that they highlighted to us as staff was just how, for want of a better word, rich the National Trust was, and just how deep its rainy day reserve was. At the time, I don't think it was even quite as much as you've just quoted, but it was significant, and it was enough such that they had no real problems in terms of the financial crash back then, or certainly no stated problems, because they could draw on funds. Also, as well, they were deliberately positioning themselves as contrary to the burden on the state that English heritage was at the time, or the perceived burden of the state, which obviously George Osborne split up into historic England and heritage and English heritage separate bodies. And there was an even bigger drive to get more members. They lived and died on membership.
mm,
The big push was to, in particular,
yes,
convert middle class people, and they did that quite bluntly using postcodes. So, for example, actually, ironically enough, even though I'm a university educated, interested in National Trust properties type person, and therefore first generation middle class, I guess you could say, my postcode, because we're also first generation middle class, is according to the data that they were using from a census in the early 2000s, not the phrase was in fit. So, in
yeah,
other words, they didn't think actually that they wanted to market to people in my area because we wouldn't turn up, or we weren't educated enough, or we weren't interested enough.
yeah.
So it's
Or
interesting.
didn't have enough disposable income to buy an expensive subscription
Precisely,
membership.
yeah, yeah, and the
Yeah,
word was conversion as well. So the idea was how many visits can you convert into memberships, and
yes,
also crucially, any charitable activities. And this is something which the reason why I'm stating this is just to declare an interest. Um, because back then in 2010, Archaeosoup was involved in a local campaign to highlight the fact that the National Trust was shutting down one of their most successful charitable activities in helping young people get out to the countryside and to these big houses, to places outside the city. They were shutting it down because none of those young people were likely to be converted into members. Uh, Never mind the fact that there was a track record of them being lifelong, well, actually, first of all, lifelong positive stories. They constantly talked about former members of this organization, and this it was called the West End Project, would speak nothing but good of the National Trust for the rest of their lives. But also, actually, many of them went on to be, surgeons, social workers, so on and so forth, despite their origins, and therefore they could become members. And this is quite a long-winded way of saying the National Trust has a certain way of viewing people who visit and people who are under their care,
mm,
through the lens of survival. We
yes,
actually, my manager actually at the time, I won't name him, just in case, but my manager at the time said that it is the self-preservation society, and they will do
yeah,
anything they can to preserve themselves,
of course,
even
yeah,
if that function shifts away from being, as it were, forever for everyone, which is their tagline, or in this
yeah.
instance, moving away from actually even necessarily taking full and proper responsibility for their collections. I mean, what will happen to things like paintings and artifacts then, if
Okay, this
experts
is
are
this is
sacked?
where we have to get a little. This is where we have to get a little bit granular.
Yeah.
Um, the 2016 review
Hmm.
set up 5 senior positions who were responsible across the trust for, and all to stress as well, this is not the National Trust for Scotland, which has a completely separate organisation, is also facing, I think we referred to it in a previous watching brief, in fact, is also putting people at risk of redundancy. We're talking about England here. The 2016 review created senior curators who were responsible for sculpture, decorative arts, furniture, textiles, and libraries. Yeah. So 5 areas where considerable subject expertise is required, as well as expertise in the curation of very sensitive, sometimes, artifacts. Right. The new model reduces those posts to 4 and divides them up by period, not by expertise in those particular areas. Now, you can immediately see a problem in that somebody who was an expert on the 18th century, and maybe even on 18th century paintings, might not know much about Tudor, or as much about Tudor paintings, or certainly 20th century modernists. And you look at, take an example, if the area is, if it's going to be on, if you're going to look at looking at expertise by period, take a house like Sissinghurst, one of the Trust's most famous and most visited house,
which has been around for more than 100 years.
Well, the thing is, you've got a Tudor moated manor house, with a modern garden that is most famous for its occupancy in the mid 20th century by Peter Sackville West. Who created the garden. So you can see the complexity around the buildings, which doesn't seem to be reflected in the proposed new structure. It also does things like, and for connoisseurs of jargon, this is glorious. The trust is divided up into regions. There are 7 of them. And at the moment, there is a lead curator for each region. That post is now going to be merged with another post, which is called Visitor Experience Consultant.
Okay.
You can see again where this is going, can't you?
Sorry, I'll mention what. Okay, you've just given me something to say from a Fit of the Month segment, but I'll come back to that when we get there. So presumably then, within this model, you'll have a period expert who will be expected to recognise, say, an ongoing curatorial or environmental concern linked with, say, let's say, paper, which needs to be stored in very particular circumstances. They're expected to recognise that and then presumably call in a freelancer if there's an issue. Is this the model?
That's the point. And in fact, one of the posts that is reported to be going is the head of archaeology across the trust.
Right. Yeah.
But the idea, that is precisely the kind of expertise that you could, if you're of a certain managerial disposition, you could say, actually, we don't need that kind of expertise 24/7 in-house. If we have, for example, a planning issue like we want to build extend a car park at a particular house, that can liaison with the planning process, the local planning committee, all the legal staff, and commissioning ground archaeological works if necessary, can be devolved to a lower paid local team because it's just routine, or it can be farmed out to a consultant, and you don't have to have that expensive expertise in-house 24/7.
Or, for example, as with the case of, is it Oxburgh Hall or Oxburgh Hall, where thousands of rare items have been found in the attic recently, with links below, including 15th century documents, I do believe. The idea is that
a wonderful accidental find of this treasure house of rubbish, which tells us so much about that particular site. And it was
well, and also in that sense, an inevitable result of owning an old property. There's going to be stuff in there, stuff in the walls, Presumably then, what they're calculating is that it's worthwhile taking the short, sharp expense, even paying over the odds, as it were, on an hourly rate for someone to come in and fix a problem, as opposed to someone staying and keeping their eye on a collection, for example, every day.
Precisely that. So you pay somebody to come in. You pay somebody to come in for a month, say, to assess the issue around paintings in the northeast region.
But that means that there's got to be an
rather.
issue before you do that. That's not preventative. That's reactive. That's basically, that means that you're going to have to get, by definition, you're going to have things which deteriorate in order to be fixed, as opposed to things which are kept in good order throughout their lifetime.
But then the idea is that I would imagine that the local curators further down the food chain, would be seen basically as monitoring and cataloguing. And if they notice mildew on one of the things that's referred to in the Burlington article is an issue around mothing in old textiles.
Mm.
So your local curator, the argument is you don't need to be an expert in 18th century silk brocade to spot if there's mothing going on. Therefore, you flag up that there's potential mothing to head office, and they pull in a pest control person and conservator.
Right. Okay.
And it's done on a contract. And it's done on a contract basis.
And all of this is in the context of collections being stored as opposed to being on display, having houses which are much more accessible for, as you say, wedding and photograph opportunities as opposed to visits.
Filming, you name it.
So once again,
the other thing we have to bear in mind is the trust doesn't just do houses. The trust also does landscapes, and although it can, it has farms and buildings that it rents, it has holiday lets and things like that, it is not easy to monetize a lot of the trust holdings. You can't monetize people walking across a public footpath so where they get a view of a beautiful 18th century hall.
Do you know what my response to that is? Boo-hoo. You're not there to monetize it. It is the national trust. It's held in trust. And also people like Beatrix Potter, infamously, especially people like Octavia Hill, wanted that stuff to be accessible to everyone forever, as their tagline says.
And the trust would say, and this is where I think we're looking at. We need to look at what's happening outside the trust, and at organisations like the now split from Historic England, English Heritage. English Heritage is now like a National Trust mini-me. And if you look at what English Heritage have had to do, or the management of English Heritage have been told to do by the government, it is to become self-supporting by 2024. Now, again, one of the big issues around COVID, one of the stories that COVID has covered over is that was already looking like an iffy proposition. It's looking even more iffy now as to whether that's even going to be possible. Yeah. But what you have is what was the national portfolio of historic sites that were owned by all of us have now been devolved by government very deliberately to that charity to get them off the government books. But you have wonderful sites like the site I visited on Sunday, Minster Lovel Hall in Oxfordshire, which is a wonderful ruined late medieval, very high status family house on the edge of the Cotswolds. Beautiful settings, right next to the local church, associations with Richard III through Francis Lovell, whose family owned it. Wonderful site. It was looking absolutely glorious when we were there on Sunday, but it's completely open to visitors. It can't be monetized because the overheads are of keeping the site permanently staffed and the security and everything else. It's just not affordable within a reasonable business model. So you've got Historic English Heritage. Sorry, I still get confused over it. English Heritage has placed itself very firmly as part of the tourist and cultural economy. And the offer to visitors, but it's doing it. The crucial thing is it can only do it through a few cash cow sites like Dover Castle, like Stonehenge.
Not through a few. There are an awful lot of sites that could be more effectively, as it were, monetized if one wants to.
If you want to use that horrible word, but if you look at the big numbers come from a few sites.
Yeah, well, then this is true. So in that sense,
in that sense, all the trust is doing, because again, English Heritage doesn't, although it has archaeologists and so on the staff now, it doesn't do archaeology and research in the way that it used to do when it was part of Historic England, or when English Heritage, was the all-encompassing entity.
Yeah, no, this
and
is
the trust
true.
is doing exactly the same. Exactly, the trust is doing exactly the same thing. The trust is just pivoting to be very clearly part of the cultural tourism offer.
Then what is the
of the
point of it?
country.
What is the point of it? That would be my question, because actually right now there have been calls from some of our colleagues to nationalise English nationalise the National Trust, in
Which
response
it
to
never
those,
has been.
which it never has
Yeah,
been, and essentially create what English heritage was by
yeah,
nationalising the National Trust. That's
yeah.
that's pie in the sky. That's not going to happen,
No,
especially with this government. And also, frankly, it
no.
shouldn't happen. One of the strengths of the National Trust was the fact that it could look after itself and fund itself. And I'm not against memberships. I'm not against having to make a profit or having to sing for your supper, as it were. I've worked for various, and the Orbit Viking Centre had to sing for its supper, but
Yeah.
despite that, there was always a clear academic or educational, indeed a charitable outcome. The Archaeological Trust is, I do believe, classed as a charity, certainly in terms of some of its activities. With the national with the National Trust, it just feels like another step away from what is clear and definable charitable activities and the purpose that it was created for. One of the reasons that, for example, some of that farmland was bought up was in order to preserve the culture of farming, which was being lost to increasing mechanization
Mm.
or being lost through, disease or changing agriculture requirements, and also arable
I,
land as well.
and,
Uh, uh,
and and also I remember particularly in the 70s and 80s and 90s I can't remember exactly when it started, but saying that there was a National Trust project called Enterprise Neptune, which
mm,
was about buying up coastal areas to create contiguous coastal paths, but also that to preserve things like the chalk grassland on the cliffs at Dover
mm,
that were
mm.
otherwise threatened by industrialised farming.
Yeah, precisely, precisely.
Mm.
Land which is incompatible with the machine in that sense. Yeah.
Mm. Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
That is the point of this institution. And if they simply move to being a backdrop for events, and they minimize their duty of care to simply
Mm.
being reactive, because essentially this collection is now a burden, and when it gets a bit moldy, or we've got to bring people in, what is the point of it? And I ask that ever more seriously, because I mean, 10 years ago I was concerned that they were becoming more and more the self-preservation society,
Mm.
turning their backs on people who actually are interested. They're just not necessarily haven't got the deepest pockets in the world.
Mm.
Now one has to ask even more, what's the point? Also, as well,
Right.
there's an
Okay.
argument to be made for the fact that actually in having full-time staff and not just having everyone as a volunteer, which actually I have issues with as well. An awful lot of people who I worked with were amazing people, but they never were paid for their time. Um, there's an argument to be made that actually in curating talent in these areas, in curatorship,
Yeah.
in curatorship, in curating that, yeah, in the care of these sorts of artifacts, and also in awareness of treatments in particular, chemical issues and so on and so forth. In curating that stuff, they're maintaining a national knowledge base as well. And turning their back on that, what is the point? It's
This is a
not everything has to be about making money, is I suppose what I'm getting at. And
right,
sorry, go on.
and I've been deliberately,
Yeah,
playing devil's advocate
yeah.
by saying what I think the management would say in response to these questions.
Mm,
Um,
I'm sure they
I
would.
actually, I actually share your concerns
Mm,
absolutely here. I think, as a bit of background though, this isn't just happening in heritage culture; it's happening across the board. In terms of, for example, the Secretary of State for Culture said recently when arts organisations, particularly arts organisations who run buildings like theatres and dance studios and things like that, said we're going to need more support to bring us through COVID.
mm,
The response of the DCMS was to say you need to be more imaginative in exploiting your commercial opportunities, and the government will be again disappointed if you don't do that. In other words, if you're not seen to take every commercial opportunity you can, your relationship with government will falter. This led to concerns, for example, that websites might be put behind paywalls,
yeah,
which will probably kill them stone dead.
yeah.
And the and the other issue you talked about government and this government renationalising not renationalising. The National Trust has never been
No.
a government organisation. And again, I agree with you. I agree it never should be. What the role of government is to make sure that the environment exists where these buildings and these landscapes can be preserved in perpetuity through the choices that we make as a community, which is a different thing. But in terms of government attitude to culture, it shows shades of Hermann Göring. There was a meeting that's been widely reported between the heads of various major cultural bodies, particularly working in the arts and theatre, performing arts, with Dominic Cummings, Prime Minister. Well, I was going to say the Prime Minister's advisor. Some people say actually the Prime Minister, in that he's the intellectual moving force behind most things that the government does. And his response when being asked for more subsidy to see those, again, huge cultural cash cows for the British economy when they're working, was, quote, the effing ballerinas can get to the back of the queue.
Yeah.
He thought that bunging more money to cultural institutions would not play well in the newly won, broadly speaking, blue-collar seats, particularly in the north of England and the Midlands, the West Midlands.
Yeah. And really, we should bring this because we are on the clock
Sure.
for this part of the watching brief. We should bring it to a close. But I suppose I would close by saying I am blue collar. I was born blue collar. I come from blue collar areas. I live in a blue collar area. I just happen to have middle class trappings,
I'm the same.
and yeah, well, exactly, yeah. And in that sense, the idea that Mr. Cummings, whose family connections are aristocratic, to say the least, somewhat bizarrely aristocratic, one might say, knows or claims to know what blue collar want and can be and can want, is an insult to me. But then again, I'm not his base. I'm never going to be on side with him. But the thing is, coming back to the National Trust, my argument always internally was, how can you expect people to become members if you don't show them the best of what you've got to offer? And if you never give them a chance? People I know, and frankly, my mum was one of those people who actually prioritised National Trust membership when she could. We were in and out over the years, but if we had a bit of extra money, it went into that sort of membership because it was a value for money day out. It was great to go to the cafe, and it felt like something that you were contributing to, despite that blue collar origin. And it's patronising, and now it's bordering on being utterly divorced from its origins. And then I don't want to keep on rambling on about it, but that's all I have to say.
I just want to make one very final quick point. And as I do urge people to, as well as the various reports and so on that we've referred to, which are all available online in various sources, and we're posting the links. Read the articles by Bendel Grover and this one in the Burlington magazine. Like you, my family relationship with the trust goes back many years. Overall we've been members. My mum and dad were volunteers for the trust in the Dover area, and again, those were people who might have moved into the middle class. They were working class people. Their interests, again, like yours, were you aspired to visit places like this, and it wasn't just pretty houses. It was working places like the Northforeland lighthouse, and so on. But I just finish with the and it's a point made again by in the article by the Burlington magazine. And it says basically what this appears to do is separate houses from the outdoors and nature, when in fact one of the reasons the trust was founded was to treat those as a harmonious whole that everybody would have access to. And the other point that it makes is that without curators on the spot with the understanding to know what they're looking at and research it and then present it to the public, particularly contentious issues like the issue of the relationship of 18th century country houses with investments in the slave trade, would lack conviction and credibility. If it's just somebody comes in and just does a postcard job of an exhibition, without a deeper understanding of the location, the wider relationships, the wider period economy, and so on. So it's
Otherwise, you're just selling cartoon character history and pretty
precisely,
postcards. Yeah,
absolutely, and jam.
and jam. Yeah, and also actually nice woolen blankets from Welsh wool.
That's yeah. And other local products are available in the Trust 7 regions.
Wales. Okay, okay, cool. Well, we'll leave it there. I think it's clear what we think of this, and also what the issues are, and hopefully the conversation below will be interesting and useful.
Just to say very quickly on that, the consultation with staff over the redundancies finishes around, I think, in about 2 weeks' time, around the middle of September. So we should hear more about what's actually going forward, and whether the arguments like the ones we're having now and the coverage in the media has had any impact on what the trust intends to do, or whether they intend to tough it out.
Yeah, okay. We'll keep an eye on it. Yeah.